My name is Serafina. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. Before that night, I thought I knew what fear was. I thought I understood vulnerability, danger, the feeling of being completely alone in a world that doesn't care if you survive or not. But I was wrong. I had no idea what true terror felt like until I met him on that desolate road, under a moonless sky that seemed to swallow every trace of light. It was late October, Dao, and the air had that bitter chill that cuts through your clothes and settles into your bones. I was driving my old sedan, a vehicle that had seen better days, whose engine sputtered and coughed like a dying man, along a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. The road was empty, eerily so, and the darkness pressed against my windshield like something alive, something hungry. In the back seat, my son was sleeping. His name is Oliver. He was only 4 years old then, small and fragile, with his father's dark curls and my gray eyes. He trusted me completely, the way children do, the way they believe their parents can protect them from anything. And there I was, alone on a road that had no name, with a car that could die at any moment, trying desperately to reach my sister's house 300 miles away. I was a single mother with barely enough money to keep us fed, running from a life that had become unbearable. The engine made a sound I'd never heard before, a grinding metallic shriek that made my heart drop into my stomach. I glanced at the fuel gauge. Quarter tank. The temperature gauge was climbing into the red zone. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Please, I whispered to the car, to God, to anyone who might be listening. Please just get us there. But prayers don't always work the way you want them to. The engine coughed once, twice, and then fell silent. The car rolled to a stop on the shoulder of the road, and suddenly the only sound was the wind howling through the trees and Oliver's soft breathing from the back seat. I sat there for a moment, frozen, staring at the dead dashboard. No lights from other cars, no houses in sight, just darkness and the skeletal silhouettes of bare trees against a starless sky. I tried the ignition. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. My phone had died an hour ago. I'd forgotten to charge it before we left, and there was no one around for miles. The isolation pressed down on me like a physical weight. This was exactly the kind of situation I'd been trying to avoid my entire life. Vulnerable, exposed, completely at the mercy of chance. I stepped out of the car, wrapping my thin jacket around myself against the cold. The wind cut through the fabric like knives. I walked around to the hood, popped it open, and stared at the engine as if I had any idea what I was looking at. Steam rose from somewhere deep inside. I could smell burning oil. It was dead. Completely, utterly dead. Damn it, I breathed, my voice barely audible over the wind. That's when I heard it. The sound of another engine, smooth and powerful, coming from behind me. I turned, shielding my eyes against the sudden glare of headlights. A car was approaching. No, not just a car. A sleek, black luxury sedan that looked completely out of place on this forgotten stretch of highway. It moved with predatory grace, sliding through the darkness like something that belonged to the night itself. My first instinct was relief. Someone who could help. Someone with a phone, or jumper cables, or at least the knowledge of where the nearest town was. But as the car slowed and pulled over behind mine, that relief curdled into something else. Something primal and ancient that made every nerve in my body scream danger. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from a distance, I could tell he wasn't ordinary. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and moved with a fluid, controlled grace that reminded me of a dancer or a predator. He wore an expensive suit, perfectly tailored, completely inappropriate for this desolate road. As he walked toward me, passing through his headlights, I got my first clear look at his face. Beautiful. That was the first word that came to mind, and I hated myself for thinking it. He had sharp, aristocratic features, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that curved into something between a smile and a smirk. His hair was dark, almost black, swept back from his forehead, but it was his eyes that made my breath catch in my throat. They reflected the light from his car in a way that human eyes shouldn't. A strange, amber glow that seemed to come from within rather than from any external source. As he drew closer, I could see that they were fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to run, to grab Oliver and disappear into the trees. Consequences be damned. "Car trouble?" he asked, and his voice was like velvet wrapped around steel. Deep, cultured, with an accent I couldn't quite place. British, maybe, or European, but ancient somehow, as if he'd learned to speak in another century. I nodded, unable to find my voice. My throat had gone completely dry. He glanced at my car, then at me, then, and this made my blood run cold, at the back seat where Oliver slept, visible through the window. "You and the child are alone?" he asked, taking another step closer. "You shouldn't be here. This road. It's not safe at night." The way he said it made it sound like a threat and a warning at the same time. I backed up against my car, every instinct screaming at me to protect my son, to put myself between this man and Oliver. "Why, we're fine," I managed to say, though my voice shook. "I just need to call for a tow truck. If you could—" "There's no cell service out here," he interrupted, moving closer still. He was only a few feet away now, and I could see details I wished I couldn't. His skin was too pale, too perfect. His movements were too smooth, lacking the small imperfections that make people human. "The nearest town is 40 miles away. Your car is dead. And the temperature is dropping." He smiled, and I saw his teeth. Normal, human teeth. But somehow that made it worse, because everything else about him screamed inhuman. "I can help you," he said, and the way he said help made it sound like a prison sentence. "No, thank you," I said quickly. "We'll wait for someone else to come along." "No one else will come," he said with absolute certainty. "I'm the only one who uses this road at night. I'm offering you shelter, food, safety, for you and your son. I don't even know you." "My name is Dorian Ashcroft," he said, extending a hand toward me. I didn't take it. "And you are?" I hesitated. Every fiber of my being told me not to tell him my name, as if giving him that information would somehow give him power over me. But what choice did I have? Oliver couldn't stay in a freezing car all night. "Serafina," I whispered. "Beautiful name," he said, lowering his hand. "Serafina, like an angel." His smile widened slightly. "How fitting." He turned away from me and walked to the back seat of my car. Before I could stop him, he opened the door. I lunged forward, but he held up a hand, stopping me with just a gesture. "I'm not going to hurt him," he said. And there was something in his voice, something almost offended, that made me pause. He reached in and carefully, gently, lifted Oliver into his arms. My son didn't wake up, just nestled against this stranger's chest as if he belonged there. "What are you doing?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. "Bringing him to warmth," Dorian said simply. "You can follow in my car, or you can stay here and freeze. Your choice, Serafina." He walked back to his car, carrying Oliver like he weighed nothing at all. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed by fear and indecision. Then I looked at my dead car, at the empty road, at the darkness that seemed to be closing in around me. I had no phone, no help coming, and my son was already in his arms. I followed him. His car was warm inside, luxuriously so. The leather seats were heated, and the interior smelled of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and sweet that I couldn't identify. Dorian had already placed Oliver in the back seat, buckled in carefully, with a blanket tucked around him. He gestured for me to sit in the front passenger seat. I climbed in, closing the door behind me. The sense of safety from the cold was immediately undermined by the sense of danger from being in such close quarters with this man. He slid into the driver's seat, his movements elegant and precise, and pulled back onto the highway. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "My home," he said. "It's not far. And then I'll call someone to tow your car in the morning," he said, glancing at me briefly. Those strange eyes seemed to glow in the darkness of the car's interior. "You and your son can stay the night. Get some rest. You look exhausted." I was exhausted. Bone deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that came from months of struggling to survive, to keep Oliver safe, to make ends meet. But I couldn't let my guard down. Not now. Not with this man. "Why are you helping us?" I asked. He was silent for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost sad. "Because someone should," he said. We drove in silence after that. The road twisted and turned through the forest, and I realized we were going deeper into the wilderness, farther from civilization. My fear grew with every mile. But what could I do? Jump out of a moving car with Oliver in the back seat, run into the woods and freeze to death. I was trapped, and he knew it. After what felt like an eternity, we turned onto a private road. Trees arched overhead, their branches forming a tunnel of darkness. And then, suddenly, there was a house. No, not a house. A mansion. 3 stories of dark stone and Gothic architecture, with turrets and arched windows that looked like eyes staring down at us. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like something out of a Victorian novel. Lights glowed in some of the windows, warm and inviting, but somehow that made it worse. This place wasn't abandoned. Someone lived here. This man lived here, alone in the middle of nowhere. Dorian parked the car and got out. He opened my door first, such old-fashioned courtesy, and then carefully lifted Oliver from the back seat. I followed him to the massive front door, which he opened with an old-fashioned key. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, walls lined with dark wood paneling and oil paintings that looked centuries old. Everything was immaculate, as if a team of servants maintained it daily, though I saw no one else around. "This way," Dorian said, leading me up a sweeping staircase. He brought us to a bedroom on the 2nd floor, large, warm, with a massive 4-poster bed and furniture that looked like antiques. He laid Oliver down on the bed gently, arranging the blankets around him with surprising care. "The bathroom is through there," he said, pointing to a door. "There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. I'll be downstairs if you need anything." "Wait," I said as he moved toward the door. "Why are you doing this? Really?" He paused, his back to me. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his profile. "Because I remember what it's like to be afraid," he said quietly, "and alone, and desperate." Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. I stood there in that beautiful, terrifying room, listening to the sound of his footsteps descending the stairs. Oliver slept peacefully, unaware of the danger we might be in. I walked to the door and tried the handle. It wasn't locked. I could leave if I wanted to. But where would I go? Into the forest in the middle of the night with a 4-year-old child? I was a prisoner, even if the door was unlocked. That first night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair next to the bed, watching Oliver breathe, listening to every sound in the house. I heard Dorian moving around downstairs, his footsteps echoing through the vast spaces. At one point, I heard music, classical, something by Mozart or Beethoven, drifting up through the floors. And just before dawn, I heard something else, a sound like wind rushing through the house, followed by the soft click of the front door opening and closing. When morning light finally filtered through the heavy curtains, I crept to the window and looked out. The forest surrounded us on all sides, dense and dark even in daylight. There was no sign of any other houses, no roads except the one we'd driven in on. We were completely isolated. Oliver woke up around 8, rubbing his eyes and looking around the unfamiliar room with confusion. "Mommy, where are we?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "We're at a friend's house, sweetheart," I lied, forcing a smile. "Our car broke down, remember?" He didn't remember. He'd been asleep through the whole thing. I helped him wash up in the enormous marble bathroom, and then we ventured downstairs to find food. The kitchen was immaculate, with modern appliances that seemed out of place in this Gothic mansion. There was fresh fruit on the counter, bread that still smelled warm, eggs in the refrigerator, as if someone had prepared it all for us, but there was no sign of Dorian. I made breakfast for Oliver, my hands shaking slightly as I cracked the eggs into a pan. Every sound made me jump. The house settling, the wind outside, the ticking of an antique clock somewhere in the depths of the mansion. "Where's the nice man?" Oliver asked through a mouthful of scrambled eggs. "What nice man, honey?" "The one who carried me. He smelled like nighttime." A chill ran down my spine. Smelled like nighttime. What did that even mean? But children sometimes said strange things. I told myself it was nothing. "He's sleeping, probably," I said. "We should be quiet." After breakfast, I tried to find a phone. I searched the kitchen, the living room, a study lined with books that looked older than the house itself. Nothing. No phone, no computer, no way to contact the outside world. The sense of being trapped intensified with every empty room I searched. I was in the study, running my hands along the spines of ancient leather-bound books, when I heard his voice behind me. Looking for something. I spun around. Dorian stood in the doorway, wearing different clothes now, dark pants and a simple black shirt that somehow made him look even more imposing. His face was expressionless, but those amber eyes watched me with unsettling intensity. "A phone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You said you'd call for a tow truck." "I did," he said, walking into the room. "They'll be here this afternoon." "I didn't hear you make any calls." "I made them from my room," he said smoothly. "I don't like to disturb guests." Guests. As if we had any choice about being here. "Thank you," I said, because what else could I say? "For everything. The room, the food. It's very kind." "It's nothing," he said, moving to stand by the window. Morning light streamed through the glass, illuminating him, and I noticed something strange. The light didn't seem to affect him the way it should. There were no shadows, no warmth to his skin. He looked carved from marble, perfect and cold. I found myself staring at him, trying to understand what I was seeing. The sunlight that would have made any normal person squint or feel warmth on their skin seemed to pass through him somehow, as if he existed on a slightly different plane of reality. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. "You have a beautiful son," he said, still looking out the window. "He must bring you great joy." "He's everything to me," I said, a protective instinct flaring up. "He's all I have." "No father?" "No," I said shortly. I didn't want to talk about Oliver's father, who had left before he was born, who had never wanted the responsibility of a child. But something about the quiet way Dorian asked, without judgment or pity, made me continue. "He left when I told him I was pregnant, said he wasn't ready for the responsibility. I haven't seen him since." "His loss," Dorian said simply, turning to look at me. "And his failure. A child is not a burden. It's a privilege. One that should be cherished, protected." The vehemence in his voice surprised me. This wasn't just polite conversation. He meant every word. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," I said carefully. His jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved away from the window, pacing slowly around the room like a caged animal. "I had a daughter once," he said finally, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Her name was Elizabeth. She had dark curls like your son, and eyes that sparkled when she laughed." He paused, his hand resting on the mantelpiece, his back to me. "She died when she was 6 years old. Fever. In those days, there was nothing that could be done." My heart clenched at the pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry." "It was a very long time ago," he said, but the way he said it suggested that time had done nothing to dull the ache. "But I remember every detail of her face, every word she ever spoke to me, the way she would run to greet me when I came home, the sound of her laughter." He turned to face me then, and I saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression that took my breath away. "When I see you with Oliver," he continued, "I remember what it was like, to have someone depend on you completely, to be trusted so absolutely. And I see how fiercely you protect him, how much you love him, and I think that's the most human thing there is. That love, that willingness to sacrifice everything for someone else. Dorian turned to look at me, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, just enough to be noticeable. "You're very brave," he said, "raising a child alone, surviving." "I don't feel brave," I admitted before I could stop myself. "I feel terrified most of the time, terrified I'm not good enough, that I'm failing him, that I can't give him everything he deserves." "Fear and bravery are not opposites," he said, moving closer to me. "The brave are those who act despite their fear. And you, Serafina, you act every single day. You love him, care for him, protect him, even when you're afraid. That's not just bravery, that's heroism." I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. No one had ever acknowledged how hard I was trying, how scared I was, how much I was struggling. "Thank you," I whispered. There was something in the way he said it that made me think he was speaking from experience, as if he knew fear intimately. But what could a man like him, wealthy, powerful, living in a mansion in the middle of nowhere, possibly fear? As if reading my thoughts, he said quietly, "I'm afraid every day too, you know." "Of what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Of losing control," he said. "Of becoming what I once was, of hurting someone who doesn't deserve to be hurt." He paused, his eyes meeting mine with startling intensity. "Of being alone forever." The tow truck never came that afternoon. Dorian apologized profusely, explained that the service had been delayed, that it would be tomorrow instead, and then tomorrow became the next day, and the next day became a week. Each time, there was an excuse. The roads were bad, the mechanic was busy, parts needed to be ordered. I should have been angry. I should have demanded he take us to the nearest town himself. But something strange was happening. The fear that had consumed me that first night was slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to fade. The mansion itself became less intimidating as I explored it. I discovered a library with thousands of books, some so old they had to be handled with gloves. I found a conservatory filled with exotic plants that shouldn't have survived in this climate, yet thrived under Dorian's careful attention. There was a gallery with paintings spanning centuries, and I realized that some of them must have been painted when Dorian was alive to see the subjects in person. Every room told a story of lives lived, of centuries passing, of a man who had accumulated not just wealth, but memories. I found myself drawn to these spaces, trying to understand the person who had created this sanctuary in the middle of nowhere. One afternoon, I discovered a room I hadn't seen before. It was smaller than the others, more intimate, and filled with personal items: a woman's jewelry box, children's toys, faded photographs in silver frames. I picked up one of the photographs, and my breath caught in my throat. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. The photograph was old, sepia-toned, from an era when photography was still a novelty, but I recognized the man immediately. Dorian, looking exactly the same as he did now, except for the smile on his face, genuine, unguarded, full of joy. "That was my family," his voice came from behind me. I turned, the photograph still in my hands. He stood in the doorway, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain, vulnerable. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," he said, stepping into the room. "I've kept this room locked for decades, but I opened it this morning. For you." "Why?" "Because I wanted you to understand," he said, moving to stand beside me. He took the photograph gently from my hands, looking at it with an expression of profound sadness. "This was taken in 1823. My wife, Catherine, my daughter Elizabeth, who I told you about, and my son, Thomas, he was 8 in this photograph." "What happened to them?" I asked softly. "Catherine died of consumption 2 years after this was taken," he said. "Thomas died in an accident shortly after. He was thrown from a horse, and Elizabeth—" His voice broke slightly. "Elizabeth died of fever, as I told you. Within 3 years, I lost everyone I loved. And that's when you were turned, I guessed. He nodded. I was mad with grief, reckless. I sought out danger, wanting to join my family in death. Instead, I found something that made death impossible. A vampire found me, saw my death wish, and decided to curse me with immortality instead. He set the photograph back on the table with infinite care. For the first century after my transformation, I was a monster, he continued. I killed without conscience, fed without mercy. I told myself that if I couldn't have love, I would have power. If I couldn't have life, I would take it from others. I became everything terrible, everything dark. What changed? I asked. A moment of clarity, he said. I had just killed a woman. I won't spare you the details. It was brutal, savage. And as I stood over her body, I heard crying. Her children had watched, 2 of them, a boy and a girl, about the same ages my own children had been. And they looked at me with the same terror my children had looked at death. He closed his eyes, the memory clearly still painful after all these years. I realized in that moment that I had become the very thing I would have died to protect my family from. That in my grief and anger, I had turned into something they would have feared and hated, and I knew I had to change. That must have been incredibly difficult, I said. It took decades, he admitted. Decades to learn control, to resist the hunger, to find ways to feed without killing, but I did it because I had to, because I needed to believe that even something as monstrous as a vampire could choose to be better. I reached out and took his hand. It was cool, as always, but I no longer found that frightening. Instead, it was just him. Just Dorian. You are better, I said firmly. You're not the monster you once were. You're the man who saves stranded mothers and their children, who reads bedtime stories and teaches piano, who has spent centuries trying to atone for his mistakes. He looked down at our joined hands, then up at my face, and the gratitude in his expression made my chest ache. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing me as more than what I am. I see exactly what you are, I corrected, and what you are is good. Maybe it was because Dorian never threatened us, never raised his voice, never came too close or made any aggressive moves. He was unfailingly polite, almost old-fashioned in his courtesy. He kept his distance, giving us space, only appearing at mealtimes or when I specifically sought him out. Or maybe it was because of how he was with Oliver. My son had no fear of him at all. From that very first morning, Oliver had been drawn to Dorian in a way that both comforted and terrified me. He would follow him around the house, asking endless questions that Dorian answered with surprising patience. He would ask Dorian to read him stories from the ancient books in the study, and Dorian would sit with him for hours, his deep voice bringing fairy tales and myths to life. I watched them together from doorways, hidden in shadows, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Tenderness. Care. Dorian would adjust Oliver's collar when it was askew, or brush his hair back from his forehead, or laugh, actually laugh, at something silly my son said. There was nothing predatory in his behavior, nothing threatening. He treated Oliver like he was precious, fragile, something to be protected. And it made me question everything I'd felt that first night. One evening, about 10 days after we'd arrived, I found them in the music room. I hadn't even known the mansion had a music room until I heard the sound of a piano drifting through the halls. I followed the music to a room on the east side of the house, where a grand piano sat by a wall of windows overlooking the forest. Dorian was playing, something complex and beautiful that I didn't recognize. His fingers moved over the keys with impossible precision, drawing music from the instrument that seemed to fill the entire room, to resonate in my chest. It was melancholic and beautiful, a piece that spoke of longing and loss and a love that transcended time. Oliver sat on the bench beside him, watching his hands move across the keys with wide-eyed wonder. My son was completely still, completely focused, in a way I rarely saw him. The music had captivated him entirely. When the piece ended, the silence that followed felt heavy, weighted with emotion. Oliver broke it with a question. Can you teach me, he asked, his small voice filled with hope. Perhaps, Dorian said, his fingers resting lightly on the keys, if your mother approves. I stepped into the room, then, and both of them turned to look at me. Dorian's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the question in his eyes, the hope. He's never shown interest in music before, I said, moving closer to them. Everyone has music inside them, Dorian said, watching me carefully, and some just need help finding it. It's one of the few purely good things in the world. It doesn't judge, it doesn't discriminate, it simply exists to create beauty and express emotion. He played a simple melody with one hand, something soft and sweet that made me think of childhood and innocence. Then he guided Oliver's small fingers to copy it. My son's face lit up with concentration, and when he managed to reproduce the notes, even if haltingly, he giggled with delight. "I did it!" Oliver exclaimed. "Mom, did you hear? I played music!" "I heard, sweetheart," I said, unable to keep the smile from my face. "You were wonderful." Dorian showed him another sequence, and another, each time patient and encouraging. He never criticized, never showed frustration when Oliver's small fingers fumbled. Instead, he would simply demonstrate again, his deep voice explaining the theory behind the notes, making it sound like magic rather than mathematics. And I stood there, watching this impossibly strange man teaching my son to play piano, and I felt something shift inside me, something fundamental that I couldn't quite name but that changed everything. He could have hurt us, could have done terrible things. We were completely at his mercy, isolated from the world. But instead, he was showing my son how to make music. He was giving Oliver something beautiful, something that would stay with him forever. He was being kind, without any expectation of reward, generous without asking for anything in return. "What was that piece you were playing when I came in?" I asked after a while, when Oliver had grown tired and wandered off to explore the books lining one wall of the music room. "Something I composed myself," Dorian said, his fingers idly playing a few notes, "about a century ago. It was beautiful and sad. It's called Requiem for the Lost," he said. "I wrote it after I made the decision to stop killing. It was my way of honoring all the lives I had taken, all the people who deserved better than they got from me." He began to play it again, and this time I listened with the knowledge of what it represented. Every note was an apology, every chord a memorial. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing I had ever heard. "You're very talented," I said when he finished. "I've had centuries to practice," he said with a slight smile. "Though I think talent is less important than passion. You can learn technique, but you can't learn to feel. And music without feeling is just noise." "Do you feel when you play?" "More than at any other time," he admitted. "Music is one of the few things that makes me feel human. That reminds me of what I was before I became this." He looked at me then, and I saw a vulnerability in his expression that made my heart ache. This powerful, immortal creature who could kill with his bare hands, who had lived for centuries, was showing me his wounds, trusting me with his pain. "Thank you for trusting me with that," I said softly. "Thank you for listening," he replied. We stayed in the music room for hours after that. Dorian played piece after piece, some classical, some of his own composition, some modern songs he had learned over the years. Oliver eventually fell asleep on the couch, and I sat in a chair nearby, letting the music wash over me, feeling it heal something inside me that I hadn't even known was broken. That night, after I'd put Oliver to bed, I found Dorian in the study. He was reading by lamplight, his elegant features cast in shadow and gold. He looked up when I entered, closing his book with one hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I wanted to thank you," I said, sitting in the chair across from him. "For being so kind to Oliver. He hasn't had much male influence in his life." "He's a remarkable child," Dorian said, setting the book aside. "Intelligent, curious, sensitive, you've raised him well." "I try," I said. "But it's hard, doing it alone, always wondering if I'm enough, if I'm doing the right things, if he'll grow up okay without a father." He'll grow up more than okay, Dorian said with certainty. He has you, and you're worth 10 absent fathers. The conviction in his voice made my throat tight with emotion. Thank you, I whispered. Then, before I could stop myself, I asked, why don't you have children of your own? A wife. This house is too big for one person. His expression darkened, just slightly. He looked away, toward the fire burning in the hearth. I had a family once, he said quietly. A very long time ago. What happened? I lost them, he said. And I learned that some people are not meant to have the things that make life worth living. There was such pain in his voice that it made my chest ache. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand over his. His skin was cold, unnaturally so, but I didn't pull away. I'm sorry, I said. He looked down at our hands, at my small, warm hand covering his larger, cold one. Then he lifted his eyes to meet mine, and I saw something in them that made my breath catch. Hunger, longing, and underneath it all, a deep, profound sadness. You should go to bed, Serafina, he said, gently pulling his hand away. It's late. I left the study, but I couldn't stop thinking about that moment, about the pain in his voice, about the coldness of his skin, about the way he looked at me, like I was something he wanted but couldn't have. The days turned into weeks, and my fear continued to fade, replaced by something more complex. Fascination, gratitude, and, though I hated to admit it, attraction. I watched him constantly, studying his movements, his expressions, the way he interacted with the world. He moved with preternatural grace, never making a sound unless he wanted to. He never ate in front of us, claiming he had unusual dietary restrictions. He avoided direct sunlight, keeping the curtains drawn during the day, only going outside after dark. And he never, ever slept, at least not when we could see him. I wasn't stupid. I'd read books, watched movies. I knew what all these things suggested, but it seemed too absurd, too impossible. Vampires weren't real. They couldn't be. But then again, nothing about Dorian Ashcroft seemed possible. One night, I couldn't sleep. It was around 3 a.m, and I'd been lying awake for hours, thinking about my life, about Oliver, about this strange situation I found myself in. I got up and wandered downstairs, seeking a glass of water. I found Dorian standing in the darkened living room, staring out the window at the forest. The moonlight cast him in silver, making him look even more otherworldly than usual. You're always awake, I said softly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't turn around. I don't sleep much. I walked over to stand beside him, looking out at the same view. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches creating dancing shadows. Are you a vampire? I asked. The question hung in the air between us. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. Would it matter if I was? He asked. My heart was pounding, but I held his gaze. I don't know. Maybe. I think I need to know the truth. He studied my face, those amber eyes searching for something. Then he reached up and pulled back his upper lip, revealing his teeth. In the moonlight, I could see them clearly. Normal, human teeth. Except for the canines, which were slightly longer, sharper than they should be. Yes, he said simply. I am. I should have run, should have grabbed Oliver and fled into the night, but instead, I just stood there, processing this information. Everything made sense now. The cold skin, the avoiding sunlight, the never sleeping, the way his eyes glowed in the dark. Are you going to hurt us? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. No, he said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute. Never. I would rather walk into sunlight and turn to ash than harm you or your son. Why? Because, he said, turning back to the window, I have spent centuries being a monster, and you and Oliver reminded me what it feels like to be human, to want to protect something, to care about someone's well-being more than my own hunger. You're hungry? I asked, alarm creeping into my voice. Always, he admitted. But I have control. I haven't fed on a human in over 100 years. I survive on animal blood, though it's never fully satisfying. The hunger is always there, like a dull ache that never goes away. I processed this information, trying to reconcile the monster he claimed to be with the man who had shown us nothing but kindness. "Thank you," I said finally, "for telling me the truth." He looked at me, surprise clear in his expression. "You're not afraid." "I am," I said honestly, "but I'm also grateful. You could have done terrible things to us, but you didn't. You protected us instead." "Protection is easy," he said. "Resisting temptation is harder." "But you did," I pointed out. "You are." He smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful, controlled expression he usually wore, and it transformed his face, made him look younger, more alive. "You're remarkable, Serafina," he said. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just stood there beside him, watching the moonlight play across the forest, feeling an odd sense of peace despite everything I'd just learned. From that night on, something changed between us. The truth had created a strange intimacy, a trust that hadn't existed before. Dorian stopped being quite so careful around me, stopped maintaining such rigid distance. He would sit closer when we talked. His hand would brush mine when we passed books or dishes. He would look at me longer than was necessary, with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. And I found myself responding, found myself seeking him out during the day, wanting his company, craving his attention. I would watch him play piano with Oliver and feel my chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to affection. I would catch myself staring at his profile while he read, tracing the line of his jaw with my eyes, wondering what it would feel like to touch. This was wrong. He was a vampire, a creature that fed on blood, that had lived for centuries, that could kill me with barely any effort at all. But he was also the person who made my son laugh, who taught him to play piano and read him stories, who looked at me like I was something precious and rare. The turning point came one evening when Oliver fell ill. He'd been fine all day, running around the mansion, exploring the library, playing his simple piano melodies. But suddenly, around dinner time, he started complaining that his head hurt. I touched his forehead and felt my heart drop into my stomach. He was burning up. "Oliver, baby, how do you feel?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "My head hurts, Mommy," he whimpered. "But then I'm so cold." He was shivering despite being bundled in blankets, his little body trembling violently. His cheeks were flushed bright red with fever, and his eyes had a glassy, unfocused quality that terrified me. I'd seen fevers before, every parent has, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. "Dorian!" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "Dorian, I need you!" He appeared instantly, moving faster than should be possible. One moment the hallway was empty, the next he was there, his expression shifting from calm to intensely focused as soon as he saw Oliver. "What happened?" he asked, already moving to Oliver's side. "I don't know, he was fine, and then suddenly..." My voice broke. "He's burning up. I don't know what to do. I don't have any medicine. I don't even know where the nearest hospital is." "Hush," he said gently, placing a cool hand on my shoulder. The touch was meant to be comforting, but I could feel the tension in his grip, the carefully controlled strength. "I'll handle this. I've dealt with fevers before. Many times." He leaned over Oliver, pressing the back of his hand to my son's forehead, his cheek, his neck. His expression darkened slightly. "How long has he been like this?" he asked. "Just started. Maybe 10 minutes. Is it bad? Dorian, is he going to be okay?" The fear in my voice must have been palpable, because Dorian looked up at me with something close to compassion in those inhuman eyes. "Children spike fevers quickly," he said calmly, though I could see the concern in the tight set of his jaw. "It doesn't mean it's serious, but we need to bring it down. Fast." He disappeared and returned moments later with a bag I'd never seen before. A large medical bag that looked like it belonged in a hospital emergency room. It was filled with supplies, fever reducers, antibiotics, thermometers, IV bags, bandages, everything imaginable. "Where did you get all this?" I asked, stunned. I've lived a long time, he said simply, pulling out a thermometer. I've learned to be prepared for everything, especially after. He paused, his expression flickering with old pain. After losing Elizabeth to fever, I swore I'd never be helpless like that again. He took Oliver's temperature with practiced efficiency. The digital thermometer beeped, and I saw his jaw tighten when he looked at the number. How high? I asked, dreading the answer. 103.8, he said. Too high. We need to bring it down now. He worked with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. He explained each step as he went, his voice steady and reassuring, even as his hands moved with supernatural speed and precision. First, we give him fever reducer, both acetaminophen and ibuprofen, staggered so they work together, he said, carefully measuring out the correct doses in small medicine cups. The combination is more effective than either alone. He helped Oliver sit up enough to take the medicine, speaking to him in a gentle voice that I'd never heard before. That's it, little one. I know it tastes terrible, but it will help you feel better. Can you swallow it for me? Good boy. You're very brave. Oliver took the medicine without protest, trusting Dorian completely despite how sick he felt. That trust, that absolute faith, made my heart ache. Now we need to cool him down physically, Dorian continued, turning to me. Serafina, I need you to get lukewarm water, not cold, that would shock his system, and some washcloths. We'll use them to bring down his temperature while the medicine works. I ran to get the supplies, my hands shaking as I filled a basin with water at exactly the right temperature. When I returned, Dorian had already stripped Oliver down to his underwear and was checking his pulse, his breathing, his skin color, with the focused attention of a skilled doctor. His heart rate is elevated, Dorian murmured, more to himself than to me. Expected with the fever, breathing is slightly labored but not distressed. No rash that I can see, which rules out several serious conditions. How do you know all this? I asked, wringing out a washcloth and placing it on Oliver's forehead. I was trained as a physician, Dorian said, surprising me. Back when medical knowledge was far less advanced than it is now, I've watched medicine evolve over centuries, learned from each new discovery. In some ways, I have more practical experience than most modern doctors, though my methods are outdated by current standards. He took a washcloth from me and began gently wiping down Oliver's arms, his neck, behind his ears, all the places where cooling would be most effective. His movements were tender, almost paternal, and I watched through tears as this ancient, powerful creature cared for my son with such gentleness. We stayed up all night together, taking turns sitting with Oliver, monitoring his temperature every 30 minutes, adjusting the damp cloths, administering medicine at precisely the right intervals. Dorian never left the room for more than a few minutes at a time, always returning with something we might need. More medicine, water for Oliver to sip, a lighter blanket, a humidifier he'd retrieved from some storage room I didn't know existed. He told me stories to keep me distracted, to keep me from spiraling into panic every time Oliver whimpered or tossed restlessly in his fever dreams. Stories about the centuries he'd lived, the things he'd seen, the people he'd known. He told me about the Black Death, about how he'd watched helplessly as millions died from disease he couldn't stop or cure. He told me about the development of antibiotics, about vaccines, about how miraculous modern medicine seemed to someone who remembered a time when a simple infection was a death sentence. Elizabeth died before there was anything I could do, he said quietly, around 3 a.m, his hand resting on Oliver's chest to feel the rise and fall of his breathing. Medical knowledge in the 1700s was primitive, barbaric even. They believed in bloodletting, in humors, in methods that did more harm than good. I stood by her bedside and watched her burn with fever, unable to do anything but hold her hand and pray to a God I wasn't sure existed anymore. He looked up at me, and I saw the anguish in his eyes, an old wound that had never fully healed. I won't let that happen to Oliver, he said with fierce determination. I have the knowledge now, the tools, the medicine. I won't be helpless again. Around 4 a.m, Oliver's fever finally broke, The thermometer showed 100.2, still elevated, but no longer dangerous. His breathing had eased, and for the first time in hours, he fell into a peaceful sleep rather than the restless, feverish tossing that had characterized the night. I sat beside him, exhausted and emotionally drained, and started to cry. From relief, from exhaustion, from the overwhelming gratitude I felt toward this impossible man who had saved my son's life. Dorian moved to sit beside my chair, and gently, hesitantly, he reached out and wiped the tears from my cheeks with his thumb. The gesture was so tender, so human, that it made me cry harder. "He's going to be fine," Dorian said softly. "The fever broke. He'll sleep now, and when he wakes up, he'll be weak but recovering." "You did well, Serafina. You stayed calm when it mattered." "I wasn't calm," I said, my voice thick with tears. "I was terrified. I kept thinking about what would have happened if we'd still been on that road, if we hadn't met you, if you hadn't been here with all these supplies and all this knowledge. He could have—" I couldn't even finish the sentence. "But he didn't," Dorian said firmly. "He's here, he's safe, and he's going to recover. That's what matters." I turned to look at him, this creature who had terrified me just weeks ago, who I'd thought might kill us, who I'd believed was a monster, and I saw only the man who had spent the entire night saving my son's life, who had shared his own grief to comfort me, who had been gentle and kind and selfless. "Thank you," I whispered. "A thank you for saving him." "I would do anything for him," Dorian said, his eyes meeting mine with startling intensity. "For both of you." Our faces were very close now. I could see every detail of his features, the flecks of gold in his amber eyes, the perfect curve of his lips, the slight shadow of stubble that shouldn't exist on someone whose body was unchanging. I could feel the coolness of his breath, smell the faint scent of leather and old books and something indefinably him. Without thinking, without analyzing, without considering the consequences, I leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft, tentative, barely more than a brush of lips, but it sent electricity through my entire body. Dorian froze for a moment, then made a sound low in his throat and kissed me back. His lips were cool but soft, and the kiss deepened, became more urgent. Then, suddenly, he pulled away. "We can't," he said, his voice rough. "Serafina, you don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking," I said, my heart pounding. "I want this. I want you." "I'm a monster," he said, standing up and backing away. "I could hurt you, could kill you. The hunger, it's always there, and when emotions run high, when desire—" He stopped, closing his eyes. "You deserve someone human, someone safe." "I don't want safe," I said, standing to face him. "I've spent my whole life playing it safe, and where has it gotten me? Alone, broke, running from a life that was slowly killing me anyway. You've shown me more kindness in these weeks than anyone has shown me in years. You've been a better father to Oliver than his real father ever was. I don't care what you are. I care about who you are." He stared at me for a long moment, conflict clear on his face. Then he said, very quietly, "If we do this, if I let myself feel what I'm feeling, I won't be able to let you go. Do you understand? Vampires mate for life. Forever. There would be no going back." "Then don't let me go," I said. Something broke in his expression. All the careful control he'd maintained for weeks shattered, and he crossed the distance between us in an instant, pulling me into his arms and kissing me with a hunger that had nothing to do with blood. We stumbled out of Oliver's room, barely able to keep our hands off each other, and made our way to Dorian's bedroom, a place I'd never been allowed before. It was dark, elegant, with heavy curtains blocking any possible sunlight and furniture that looked like it came from another century. He laid me down on his bed, and we spent the rest of the morning learning each other. His body was cool but solid, strong in ways that reminded me he wasn't human, but his touch was gentle, reverent, as if I was something sacred he'd been waiting centuries to find. Afterward, we lay tangled together, my head on his chest where his heart beat slow and steady, slower than mine, but still beating, I love you, he said into the darkness. I've loved you since the moment I saw you on that road, so fierce and protective of your child. I knew then that I would do anything to keep you safe. I love you too, I said, and realized I meant it. Against all logic, against all sanity, I had fallen in love with a vampire. The weeks that followed were the happiest of my life. Dorian was attentive, caring, passionate in ways I'd never experienced. He treated me like a queen and Oliver like a prince. He taught us both so many things: how to appreciate music, how to find beauty in darkness, how to be brave in the face of the unknown. Our days fell into a comfortable rhythm that felt surprisingly domestic despite the extraordinary circumstances. Oliver would wake up early, and Dorian would already be in the kitchen preparing breakfast. He couldn't eat it himself, but he'd learned to cook over the centuries, and he took pride in making us elaborate meals: pancakes shaped like animals, omelets with fresh herbs from the greenhouse I'd discovered behind the mansion, fruit arranged in intricate patterns that made Oliver laugh with delight. After breakfast, Oliver would practice piano while I helped Dorian with various tasks around the mansion. The place was enormous, and even with his supernatural efficiency, there was always something that needed attention. I learned that he maintained everything himself: the gardens, the repairs, the cleaning. He'd had staff in the past, he told me, but found it too difficult to hide what he was from people who saw him every day. Besides, he said once, while we were working together to reorganize the library, I rather enjoy the solitude, or I did, until you arrived. Now I can't imagine going back to being alone. In the afternoons, Dorian would give Oliver lessons, not just piano, but history, languages, science, art, everything a child should learn and more. He was an incredible teacher, able to make even the most complex subjects fascinating. He would tell stories about historical events he'd personally witnessed, speak in languages that were now considered dead, explain scientific principles with examples he'd seen develop over centuries. I would often sit in on these lessons, learning alongside my son. Dorian never made me feel foolish for not knowing things, never talked down to either of us. Instead, he shared his vast knowledge with genuine joy, clearly thrilled to have people who wanted to learn from him. And the evenings were ours. After Oliver went to bed, Dorian and I would spend hours together. Sometimes we would talk, sitting by the fireplace while he told me stories about the centuries he'd lived. He'd known famous historical figures, witnessed events I'd only read about in books, traveled to places that no longer existed. Each story revealed another layer of the man he was, the experiences that had shaped him. Other times, we wouldn't talk at all. We would simply be together, reading side by side in the library, listening to music in the music room, or wrapped in each other's arms in his bed, exploring the connection between us with growing confidence and deepening intimacy. Dorian told me everything about his past, holding nothing back, about being turned in the 1600s by a vampire who found him grieving his family's deaths and thought eternal life would be a cruel punishment for someone who wanted to die. About the decades he'd spent as a true monster, feeding without conscience, killing without remorse, becoming exactly the creature of nightmare that humans feared. I was angry, he explained one night, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm as we lay together in the darkness. Angry at God for taking my family. Angry at the world for continuing to exist when everything I loved was gone. Angry at myself for surviving when they didn't. And I turned that anger outward, made everyone else suffer because I was suffering. What changed? I asked softly. A moment of clarity, he said, his voice heavy with old guilt. I had just killed a young mother in front of her children, 2 of them, a boy and a girl, about the same age as my own children had been, and they looked at me with the same terror my children had looked at death. The same incomprehension, the same betrayal, the same desperate hope that somehow they could be saved. He was quiet for a long moment, and I felt his body tense against mine. I realized in that moment that I had become the very thing I would have died to protect my family from, he continued. That in my grief and anger, I had turned into something they would have feared and hated. My daughter Elizabeth, she was gentle, kind, would cry when animals were hurt. What would she think of her father if she could see what I'd become? And I knew that I had to change, That if there was any honor left in me, any love for the family I'd lost, I had to become something they wouldn't be ashamed of. That must have been incredibly difficult, I said. It was torture, he admitted. Learning control after decades of giving in to every impulse. Teaching myself to resist the hunger, to find alternative sources of blood, to see humans as people rather than prey. It took me the better part of 2 centuries to get where I am now. And even now, the hunger never goes away. Every moment is a choice. He turned to face me, his amber eyes glowing softly in the darkness. But you make that choice easy, he said. When I'm with you, when I see Oliver smile, when I hear your laughter, it reminds me why I made that change, why it's worth fighting the monster inside. You give me something to protect, something to care about, something to be better for. I kissed him, pouring all my love and gratitude into that kiss. He responded with equal passion, his cool hands sliding over my warm skin, and we lost ourselves in each other once again. He also taught me practical things I hadn't expected, how to defend myself, how to fight, how to handle weapons. Because, he explained, loving a vampire meant living in a dangerous world. There are others of my kind who aren't as controlled as I am, he said during one of our training sessions in a room of the mansion I'd never seen before, a kind of gymnasium with practice weapons and combat equipment. Or if they find out about you, about my attachment to humans, you could be in danger. Some vampires see humans as nothing more than food. Others actively hunt those of us who try to live differently. Why? I asked, practicing the defensive stance he'd shown me. Because we threaten their worldview, he said, moving around me in a circle, watching my form. If vampires can choose to be moral, to resist our nature, then what excuse do they have for the atrocities they commit? It's easier to eliminate the examples that prove it's possible to be different than to face the fact that they're choosing to be monsters. He moved suddenly, faster than I could track, and I found myself on the mat with him looming over me, except he'd controlled the takedown perfectly, ensuring I wasn't hurt. You left your left side open, he said, helping me up. If that had been a real attack, you'd be dead or seriously injured. Again. We practiced for hours, day after day. He taught me how to anticipate attacks, how to use an opponent's strength against them, how to find and exploit weaknesses. He showed me how to handle knives, stakes, even firearms, though he warned me that traditional vampire mythology was largely false. Wooden stakes to the heart won't kill us, he explained, though they do hurt quite a lot and can immobilize us temporarily. Silver doesn't affect us at all. That's werewolf mythology that got mixed up with vampire lore. Sunlight does harm us, but it's not instant death. It's more like a severe sunburn that gets progressively worse the longer we're exposed. Holy water, garlic, crosses, all nonsense invented by superstitious humans. So what can kill you? I asked, both curious and dreading the answer. Complete destruction of the body, he said seriously. Decapitation, being burned to ashes, catastrophic injury that the body can't heal from. We regenerate very quickly from most injuries, but if you remove the head or destroy the heart completely, we die like anything else. The thought of Dorian being hurt, being killed, made my chest tighten with fear. I will always protect you, he said, reading my expression. But I need you to be able to protect yourself too, and to protect Oliver if something happens to me. That's why we train. Not because I expect you to fight off a vampire. You're human. That's nearly impossible. But because I want you to have every possible advantage, every tool at your disposal. I trained hard, driven by the desire to never be helpless again, to be able to protect my son, to be worthy of standing beside this incredible man who was teaching me to be strong. And through it all, Oliver thrived. My son, who had been quiet and reserved before, blossomed under Dorian's attention. He laughed more, asked questions constantly, showed a curiosity and joy that I hadn't seen since his early childhood. He called Dorian Papa, now, naturally and without prompting, and Dorian's face would light up every time he heard it. They had their own relationship, independent of me. Dorian would take Oliver on walks through the forest at dusk, teaching him about plants and animals, showing him how to move quietly through the woods. They would spend hours in the music room. Dorian teaching Oliver increasingly complex pieces, patient and encouraging even when my son fumbled the notes. One evening, I found them in the study. Oliver curled up against Dorian's side while he read aloud from an ancient book of fairy tales. The sight of them together, this ancient, powerful vampire and my small, mortal son, both completely comfortable with each other, made my heart feel too big for my chest. "Mama!" Oliver called when he saw me. "Papa is reading me about knights and dragons. Did you know dragons used to be real?" I looked at Dorian, who gave me a slight, mysterious smile. "Everything is real, little one. Some things just hide better than others." Later, after Oliver was asleep, I asked Dorian if dragons had really existed. "I've never seen one," he admitted. "But I've met vampires, werewolves, witches, and things that don't even have names in human languages. The world is far stranger than most people know, and I've learned never to say something is impossible just because I haven't experienced it yet." 3 months after that first night on the road, 3 months of learning to love and be loved by this impossible man, Dorian asked me to marry him. We were in the music room, Oliver playing a simple tune on the piano that Dorian had taught him, when he suddenly pulled a ring from his pocket. It was antique, beautiful, with a large ruby surrounded by small diamonds. "This was my mother's," he said. "I've carried it for over 400 years, waiting for the right person." He got down on one knee, ignoring Oliver's delighted gasp. "Serafina, will you marry me? Will you let me spend whatever time we have left together, whether that's decades or centuries, loving you and your son?" I looked at this man who had started as my captor, my terror, and had become my protector, my lover, my unexpected savior. I looked at Oliver, whose face was lit up with joy at the possibility of Dorian becoming his father officially, and I knew there was only one answer. "Yes," I said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." We were married in the small chapel on the grounds of the estate, with just the three of us present. Dorian wore a black suit that made him look like a prince from a Gothic fairy tale. I wore a simple white dress that he'd had made for me, fitted perfectly to my body, and Oliver wore a little suit, standing between us as both ring-bearer and witness to our union. There was no officiant. Dorian said the words himself, ancient vows from a time long past, and I repeated them, binding myself to him for whatever forever meant. That night, after Oliver was asleep, Dorian asked me a question I'd been expecting but dreading. "Do you want to be turned?" he asked, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. "To become like me? To have forever?" I'd thought about it. Of course I had. The idea of spending centuries with him was tempting. Never getting old, never getting sick, having the power and strength he possessed. But there was one thing that stopped me. "What about Oliver?" I asked. "If I'm turned, I'll outlive him. I'll watch my son grow old and die while I stay young forever. I don't know if I can do that." "He could be turned too," Dorian said carefully. "When he's older, when he's lived a full human life and is ready. And if he doesn't want to be?" Dorian was quiet for a moment. "Then you would have to make a choice. Your son or eternity with me." "That's not a choice," I said immediately. "Oliver comes first, always." "I know," Dorian said, and there was no anger in his voice, only acceptance. "And I love you all the more for it. We'll live as we are for now. And when the time comes, we'll make whatever decisions need to be made." So we built a life together, the three of us in that Gothic mansion in the middle of nowhere. Dorian officially adopted Oliver, making him legally his son. He set up accounts to ensure we'd always be taken care of, even if something happened to him. He taught Oliver everything he knew: history, languages, music, art, combat. He was the father my son had never had, and he took that role seriously. And he loved me with an intensity that sometimes took my breath away. Every day, he found new ways to show me I was cherished. He would leave notes for me to find, bring me flowers from the forest, commission artists to paint my portrait, write music inspired by me. "You gave me back my humanity," he told me once. "You reminded me that monsters can choose to be more than their nature." Years passed. Oliver grew from a small child into a thoughtful, intelligent boy. I grew older, not much, but enough to notice the first fine lines around my eyes, the first strands of gray in my hair. Dorian never changed, never aged, eternally frozen in the moment of his transformation centuries ago. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with sadness in his eyes, and I knew he was thinking about time, about mortality, about the day when I would be old and he would still be young. But he never pressured me, never tried to convince me to turn. He'd promised me a choice, and he kept that promise. When Oliver was 12, he came to me with a question I'd been dreading. "Mom," he said seriously, "I know what Dorian is." My heart stopped. "You know?" "I've known for years," he said. "I'm not stupid. He doesn't sleep, doesn't eat, doesn't age. He's stronger and faster than anyone I've ever seen, and sometimes, when he thinks no one's looking, I see his fangs." "Are you afraid of him?" I asked carefully. "No," Oliver said without hesitation. "He's my dad. He's the best dad anyone could ask for. I wanted you to know that I know, and that it's okay." I pulled him into a hug, this boy who was already too wise for his age, and marveled at how accepting he was of the impossible. "Would you want to be like him?" I asked. "Someday." Oliver thought about it seriously. "Maybe, when I'm older, when I've done everything I want to do as a human, but I think I'd like to have forever with you guys. It seems nice, not having to say goodbye." That conversation stayed with me. It made me think about my own mortality, about the choice I'd been avoiding. And one night, I finally brought it up to Dorian. "I want to be turned," I said, "not now, but someday, when Oliver is grown and settled and doesn't need me in the same way. I want forever with you." Dorian's expression transformed with joy and relief. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "You gave me a life I never thought possible. You gave my son a father. You gave us safety, love, and a home. I want to spend eternity showing you how grateful I am." He kissed me then, deep and passionate, and I felt his tears on my cheeks, tears I hadn't known vampires could cry. "I will make you so happy," he promised, "for every day of forever." Now, 20 years after that night on the dark road, I'm sitting in the music room of our home, listening to Oliver play piano for his own children, my grandchildren, who know nothing yet about what their grandfather truly is. Dorian sits beside me, his hand in mine, eternally young while I've finally started to show my age. In a few years, when Oliver's children are older and I've had time to truly experience being a grandmother, I'll make the change. Dorian will turn me, and we'll have the forever we've been planning for. Oliver has already decided he'll join us eventually, unwilling to be separated from his family for eternity. People might say I'm crazy for loving a monster, for choosing to become one myself, but they don't know Dorian like I do. They don't know how he holds me when I cry, how he makes me laugh, how he looks at Oliver with such profound love and pride. They don't know how safe I feel in his arms, how cherished, how completely and utterly adored. The man who terrified me on that dark road, who I thought was going to destroy me, ended up saving me instead. He saved all of us. And now, knowing everything I know, having lived the life I've lived with him, I wouldn't change a single thing. Not the fear of that first night, not the weeks of uncertainty, not the moment I discovered the truth about what he was. Because all of it, every terrifying, exhilarating, impossible moment, led me here. To love, to family, to a home that's ours, built on trust and sacrifice, and the choice to see beyond the monster to the man beneath. My name is Seraphina Ashcroft, and this is my story. The story of how I fell in love with darkness and found the light within it. The story of how fear transformed into trust, and trust into love, and love into something eternal. And I would do it all again. Every single terrifying, beautiful moment, without hesitation, without regret, forever.